I'm Natalie Morgan, 32, sitting frozen in the courtroom as my soon-to-be ex-husband James smirks confidently beside his expensive attorney. The judge holds the sealed medical envelope that will determine custody of our daughter Emma. James just publicly accused me of being sterile, claiming I used a donor egg for our IVF without telling him. The paternity of our daughter questioned in open court, implying she's not biologically related to either of us. My hands tremble as the judge breaks the seal, the look on James's face changing as the judge reads the contents. Counsel, approach the bench immediately. Before I dive into how I ended up in that courtroom with my entire life hanging in the balance, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. This journey taught me that support can come from the most unexpected places. If my story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of survivors. Trust me, what happened next in that courtroom changed everything not just for me, but for the entire Harrison family legacy. 6 years ago, my life changed forever when I met James Harrison at a charity gala in Boston. I was working as an event coordinator, running around making sure everything went perfectly for the city's elite. James was heir to the Harrison real estate empire, worth well over $100 million, and the moment he walked in, everyone noticed. Tall, with piercing blue eyes and a smile that could charm anyone, he commanded attention without even trying. I never expected him to notice me. I was rushing past with a tray of champagne when someone bumped into me, nearly causing a disaster. James caught the tray with remarkable reflexes, steadying me with his other hand. "Careful there," he said, his voice warm and deep. "These events can be hazardous to your health." We ended up talking for the rest of the evening. I forgot about my duties, something I'd never done before. My boss wasn't happy, but by the end of the night, I had James Harrison's number in my phone and butterflies in my stomach. Our romance was straight out of a movie. Within a week, he was sending extravagant flower arrangements to my tiny apartment. By the second week, he invited me to dinner at the most exclusive restaurant in the city. By the end of the month, we were jetting off to his family's private island for a weekend getaway. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he told me as we walked along the pristine beach. "You see the real me, not just the Harrison name." Coming from a middle-class family in a small town outside of Boston, I was overwhelmed by his world. The private jets, the multiple homes, the staff that seemed to anticipate our every need. But James made me feel like I belonged. He introduced me to his friends, brought me to business functions, and seemed proud to have me on his arm. His family was another story. The first time I met his mother Vivian at their estate in Beacon Hill, she looked at me like I was something the cat dragged in. "So you're an event planner," she said, making my profession sound like I collected garbage for a living. How industrious. James usually dates models or daughters from our social circle. Despite his mother's cold reception, James proposed 6 months after we met. The ring was a flawless 5-carat diamond that had been in his family for generations. The wedding was a lavish affair at the Harrison estate, with over 500 guests, most of whom I'd never met. I could feel Vivian's disapproving eyes on me throughout the ceremony, but James squeezed my hand and whispered that nothing else mattered but us. After the wedding, I moved into his penthouse overlooking the harbor. James suggested I quit my job. "You don't need to work anymore, darling," he said, wrapping his arms around me. "I want to take care of you." At the time, I thought it was romantic. I didn't recognize it as the first step in isolating me from my independence. Within months, he had taken control of our finances. He added me to some accounts but managed everything himself. When I mentioned wanting to start my own event planning business, he frowned. "Why would you want the stress? Besides, it wouldn't look good for a Harrison wife to be working like that. People might think I can't provide for you." I began noticing other controlling behaviors. He questioned me when I wanted to meet friends from my old job. He insisted on knowing where I was at all times. He even had his driver take me everywhere, claiming it was for my safety but effectively monitoring my movements. 2 years into our marriage, the topic of children came up. James was very specific about wanting children, particularly a son to carry on the Harrison name. "It's important to continue the bloodline," he explained, showing me photos of Harrison men going back generations. "The family legacy depends on it." I was excited about becoming a mother and agreed it was time to start trying. I didn't realize then that our fertility journey would expose the ugly truth behind the fairy tale I thought I was living. or that James's obsession with his genetic legacy would eventually lead to the destruction of everything we'd built together. After a year of trying to conceive naturally with no success, James insisted we see a specialist. Dr. Reynolds was the best reproductive endocrinologist in Boston, with a practice that catered exclusively to the wealthy elite. Her office had marble floors and a waiting room that looked like a luxury hotel lobby. "We'll figure out what's going on," she assured us during our first consultation. "Many couples face challenges conceiving. It's more common than you might think." After numerous tests, the diagnosis hit me like a truck: diminished ovarian reserve at age 29. In simple terms, I had fewer eggs than expected for someone my age, and their quality was compromised. The doctor explained that while pregnancy wasn't impossible, it would be significantly more difficult without intervention. "IVF is your best option," Dr. Reynolds said, looking at her charts. "Given your condition, Natalie, we'll need to be aggressive with the treatment." James was supportive at first. "We'll do whatever it takes," he promised, squeezing my hand as I fought back tears in the doctor's office. But as the months passed and the treatments failed, his attitude changed. Each negative pregnancy test seemed to chip away at his patience. After our third failed IVF cycle, I found him on the phone with his mother. "I don't know, Mom," he was saying, not realizing I could hear. "The doctors say it's her eggs. They're just not viable." "Yes, I know about the inheritance stipulations." "No, I'm not considering that yet." The inheritance stipulations, as I would later learn, referred to the Harrison family trust. The bulk of the family fortune was tied up in a trust that could only be passed down to biological heirs. If James couldn't produce a biological child, his cousin would become the primary beneficiary. The pressure intensified at every family gathering. Vivian would corner me with questions about our progress. "You know, I had James 9 months after my wedding day," she mentioned during a particularly uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner. "Harrison women have always been fertile. Perhaps you should try those herbal supplements I sent you." James began obsessively researching fertility treatments. Our bathroom cabinet filled with expensive supplements. He tracked my cycle with an app on his phone and scheduled sex-like business appointments. The romance vanished from our marriage, replaced by a clinical determination to produce a Harrison heir. After our fourth failed IVF attempt, Dr. Reynolds suggested we consider using donor eggs. "Your eggs are simply not responding to the stimulation, Natalie," she explained gently. "With your age and condition, donor eggs would significantly increase your chances of success." I was open to the idea. All I wanted was to be a mother, and I didn't care about the genetic connection. But James reacted as if she'd suggested something criminal. "Absolutely not," he snapped, his face reddening. "The child needs to be biologically ours, both of us." "But James," I argued later that night, "it would still be your biological child, and I would carry the baby. We would be the parents in every way that matters." "It's not an option," he said firmly. "Neither is adoption or surrogacy. The Harrison line needs to continue properly." By this point, we'd been trying for over 2 years. We'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on treatments, though money was never an issue for James. The emotional toll, however, was becoming unbearable. I felt like a failure, my worth as a wife tied to my ability to produce a child with Harrison DNA. I found support in an online community for women struggling with infertility, logging in secretly when James was at work. There, I met Rebecca, a fertility nurse who worked at a different clinic. She became my virtual shoulder to cry on, offering advice and encouragement when I felt most alone. "Your worth isn't tied to your fertility," she reminded me during one particularly dark moment, "and there are many paths to motherhood." As we approached our 5th IVF cycle, Dr. Reynolds pulled me aside during an appointment when James stepped out to take a call. "Natalie, I want to be completely honest with you," she said quietly. "Given your previous responses, this cycle has a less than 10% chance of success. I legally have to continue if you insist, but I'm concerned about the physical and emotional toll on you." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "It's not just about having a baby anymore," I confessed. "It's about saving my marriage. If I can't give him a child, I don't know what will happen to us." Dr. Reynolds squeezed my hand. "That's a heavy burden to carry. Whatever happens, remember that none of this is your fault." Little did I know that our fifth and final IVF attempt would not only succeed against all odds, but would also set in motion a chain of events that would expose the darkest secrets of the Harrison family. When the pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines after our final IVF attempt, I couldn't believe my eyes. I took 5 more tests just to be sure. Each one confirmed what seemed impossible: I was pregnant. James was ecstatic. The moment I told him, he lifted me off the ground, spinning me around our bedroom before suddenly setting me down with concern. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes wide. "I shouldn't jostle you. We need to be careful now." Within hours, he had called everyone in his family. By evening, his mother Vivian was at our door with an expensive baby journal and a smug smile. "I knew you had it in you eventually," she said, patting my still flat stomach. "Harrison blood always finds a way." My pregnancy progressed without complications. James transformed into the attentive husband I'd first fallen in love with. He hired the top obstetrician in the country, a nutritionist to plan my meals, and a pregnancy concierge to handle my every need. I should have been thrilled, but something felt off about his sudden devotion. "I want to run some additional genetic tests," James said when I was 16 weeks along. "The doctor already did the standard screening," I pointed out. "She said everything looks normal." "I want to be thorough," he insisted. "The Harrison genes carry certain traits we should check for." I refused the additional testing, which led to our first major argument since learning I was pregnant. James didn't speak to me for 3 days afterward. As my belly grew, Vivian's attitude toward me warmed considerably. She invited me to tea at the Harrison estate, where she showed me the family nursery that had been used for generations. "We're renovating it for your little one," she said, running her hand over the antique crib. "Every Harrison baby has slept here for at least the first night." "That's thoughtful, but we've already prepared a nursery at home," I replied. Her smile tightened. "James didn't tell you? The baby will spend the first 3 months here, where we have a full staff to help." I confronted James that evening, furious about decisions being made without me. "It's tradition," he defended. "Besides, my mother has hired the best newborn nurses. You'll be here too, of course." "I'm not giving birth to my child and then handing it over to your mother," I said firmly. "We're staying in our home." He eventually relented, but the argument revealed how James viewed my role. I was merely the vessel for the next Harrison heir. Emma Grace Harrison was born on a snowy December morning after 20 hours of labor. She was perfect, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, with a dusting of dark hair and, remarkably, James's piercing blue eyes. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I felt a love so powerful it took my breath away. James, however, was oddly detached. He peered at her intently, examining her features with an analytical gaze that seemed more appropriate for a business acquisition than a newborn daughter. "She has my eyes," he noted with obvious relief, "and my mother's chin, definitely a Harrison." His family arrived within hours, Vivian leading the charge into my hospital room with an entourage of relatives eager to inspect the newest Harrison. "Let me see her," Vivian demanded, practically snatching Emma from my arms. "Oh yes, she's a Harrison through and through, thank goodness." The first few months with Emma were a mix of joy and struggle. I battled postpartum depression while trying to find my footing as a mother. James hired a night nurse against my wishes, insisting I needed rest. In reality, it limited my time alone with Emma. Despite these challenges, the bond between my daughter and me grew stronger each day. Her smile became my reason for getting up in the morning. Her tiny hand wrapped around my finger gave me strength I never knew I had. Around Emma's first birthday, I discovered something disturbing. While using James's laptop to order supplies for Emma's birthday party, an email notification popped up from a company called DNA Discovery. The subject line read, "Your home DNA test kit has shipped." Curious, I opened the email and found that James had ordered a home DNA testing kit with express delivery. The confirmation showed it wasn't the first order either. He had purchased 3 kits in the past year. Later that week, while James was on a business trip, I searched his office and found a locked drawer in his desk. Using the spare key I knew he kept in his closet, I opened it to discover a folder labeled Emma, Genetic Verification. Inside were results from hair samples and cheek swabs, along with notes in James's handwriting questioning the results. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I realized he had been secretly testing Emma's DNA, likely taking samples while I wasn't looking or instructing the nanny to collect them. I confronted him when he returned, waving the folder in his face. "What is this?" I demanded. "Have you been testing our daughter behind my back?" "You went through my private things," he deflected, snatching the folder from my hand. "Answer me, James. Why are you secretly testing Emma's DNA?" After a long pause, he sighed. "I needed to be sure." "Sure of what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That she's mine," he said coldly. "Given your condition, I had concerns about what really happened during the IVF process." His words cut deeper than any knife. After everything we'd been through, he still doubted me, still obsessed over his precious Harrison genes. "Emma is our daughter," I said through tears. "How dare you question that?" "The tests are inconclusive," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "The samples must have been contaminated." I left the room before I said something unforgivable. That night, as I watched Emma sleep in her crib, I made a decision. I needed to protect my daughter from the toxic obsession with bloodlines and heritage that had poisoned the Harrison family for generations. The next day, I opened a separate bank account and began transferring small amounts from the gifts Emma had received, creating a safety net James knew nothing about. I had no idea how soon I would need it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after I discovered the DNA tests. James was supposed to be at a development meeting for a new Harrison property downtown. Emma was napping, and I was using James's home office computer to order her new clothes since my laptop was being repaired. When I opened the browser, it automatically loaded his email. I was about to close it when a message from Vivian caught my eye. The subject line read, "Natalie situation, next steps." I knew I shouldn't read it, but something instinct perhaps made me click. "James, the PI has completed his investigation into Natalie's medical history," Vivian had written. "As we suspected, there are discrepancies in her fertility treatment records. I've attached his full report. If she used donor eggs without your consent, we have grounds to invalidate your prenuptial agreement and petition for full custody. Emma may not be biologically hers, which gives us leverage." My hands shook as I downloaded the attachment. It was a detailed report from a private investigator who had been tracking my medical history for over a year. He had accessed records through what appeared to be illegal means, interviewed staff at the fertility clinic, and even followed me to appointments. I scrolled down and saw another email thread between James and someone named Martin Goodman, his attorney. "We need evidence that she intentionally defrauded you," Martin wrote. "The consent forms for the IVF procedure were signed by both of you. We need to prove she went behind your back." James's reply chilled me to the bone. "I've installed monitoring software on her phone and laptop. If she contacts the clinic or discusses this with anyone, we'll know. The nanny reports to me directly about her movements. Once we have solid proof, we'll move forward with the divorce and custody filing." I felt physically ill. My husband had been spying on me, building a case against me, all while playing the role of devoted father and husband. The ultimate goal was clear: to take Emma away from me. In a panic, I checked other folders in his email and found one labeled Natalie Surveillance. It contained weekly reports from a PI about my movements, screenshots of my text messages, and recordings of my phone calls. There were even photos of me with friends, shopping, and at the park with Emma. The depth of the betrayal was unfathomable. The man I had married, the father of my child, had been methodically plotting to destroy me. I took photos of the emails with my phone and forwarded key messages to my personal email before deleting the sent copies from his outbox. Then I went to our bedroom and threw up in the bathroom. Once the initial shock subsided, I called the one person I trusted, Rebecca, my fertility nurse friend from the online support group. We had met in person several times for coffee, and she had become a dear friend. "He's been planning this for over a year," I told her, my voice breaking. "He's going to try to take Emma from me by claiming I'm not her biological mother." "That's absurd," Rebecca said. "You underwent IVF with your own eggs. I've seen the medical records." "He's saying I used donor eggs without his knowledge. He has a PI gathering evidence and his mother is involved too." Rebecca was silent for a moment. "Natalie, listen carefully. You need to secure your documents and Emma's. Birth certificate, medical records, everything. And you need to consult an attorney immediately, one not connected to the Harrisons." "I don't have access to that kind of money," I admitted. "James controls all our finances." Do you have anything in your name? Jewelry you could sell? Family who could help? I thought of the secret account I'd been building with cash gifts meant for Emma. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I'll figure something out, I promised. That night, I went through the motions of dinner and bedtime routine with Emma, smiling at James as if nothing had changed. When he mentioned an overnight business trip the next day, I expressed appropriate disappointment. The moment his car left for the airport the following morning, I sprang into action. I packed essential items for Emma and myself, grabbed her medical records and birth certificate from our safe, and withdrew the maximum amount from the ATM using my personal card. I called my sister Melissa, who lived 2 hours away in a small town. James had always deemed too provincial to visit. I need a place to stay, I explained without details. Just for a while, until I figure things out. Is Emma coming too? She asked, immediately concerned. Yes, we'll be there by noon. As I was placing Emma in her car seat, my phone rang. It was James. Where are you going? He demanded without preamble. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? The security system notified me that the front door opened. Are you taking Emma somewhere? I'd forgotten about the smart home system he'd installed. Just to the park, I lied. It's a nice day. With 3 suitcases? His voice was dangerous now. The nanny called me. She arrived early and saw you loading the car. James, I can explain. If you leave that house with my daughter, I will have you charged with kidnapping, he threatened. The car has GPS. I know exactly where you are. Go back inside now, Natalie. I had underestimated him. Even from a distance, his surveillance net was tight. We're just going to visit Melissa, I said, trying to sound casual. I thought it would be nice while you're away. Return to the house immediately, he ordered. We'll discuss this when I get back tomorrow. I had no choice but to comply, at least temporarily. But as I unpacked our bags, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I needed help, and I needed it fast. James Harrison was preparing for war, and I was severely outgunned. If you've ever felt that sinking feeling when you realize someone you trusted completely has betrayed you, you know exactly what I was going through. I never imagined my husband would go to such lengths to take my daughter away. But I was about to discover that his betrayal went even deeper than I knew. If you're finding this story helpful, or if you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought their money and power could take everything from you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear how I fought back against impossible odds. Finding an attorney who would take on a Harrison in Boston proved nearly impossible. The family had connections throughout the city's legal community, with partnerships, donations, or business relationships creating conflicts of interest everywhere I turned. After 5 rejections, I found Sarah Chen, a fierce divorce attorney who had recently relocated from New York and had no ties to the Harrison empire. Her office was modest compared to the mahogany-paneled firms I'd visited previously, but her reputation was formidable. They're building a case to prove you committed reproductive fraud, she explained after reviewing the emails I'd forwarded to myself. It's an emerging area of family law, but essentially, they're claiming you used donor eggs without James's knowledge or consent, making Emma biologically his but not yours. But that's not true, I insisted. We used my eggs. I have the medical records. Which they'll claim were falsified or that you somehow manipulated the process, Sarah countered. They don't need to prove it happened. They just need to create enough doubt to convince a judge that Emma's best interests lie with her biological father, especially when that father can provide every advantage money can buy. 2 days after my failed escape attempt, I was served with divorce papers. James had filed citing fraud and reproductive deception. Accompanying the divorce petition was an emergency custody motion requesting that Emma remain in the Harrison family home with James as the primary custodian. He claims you're a flight risk, Sarah explained, reviewing the paperwork. Given your recent attempt to leave with Emma, the judge might be sympathetic to his argument. The court ordered me to return to the family penthouse during the proceedings. James had moved into the guest suite, leaving me our bedroom. On the surface, it seemed civilized, but I was effectively a prisoner. Security cameras monitored the common areas. The staff, always loyal to James, watched my every move. My access to the building was restricted, so I couldn't leave with Emma without permission. They're isolating you and monitoring you, Sarah observed during one of our private meetings in her office. It's a classic abuser tactic. just executed with a lot more money and sophistication than most can manage. Discovery revealed that James had hired not one but 3 private investigation firms to build his case. They had interviewed my former colleagues, neighbors, even distant family members. His legal team had assembled a character assassination portfolio, portraying me as a gold digger who had trapped James through reproductive deception. "We need to fight fire with fire," Sarah advised. "They're attacking your character and your biological connection to Emma. We need to focus on 2 fronts: proving your biological relationship and exposing James's controlling and abusive behavior." The judge ordered genetic testing for Emma and both of us. I readily agreed, knowing it would prove I was her biological mother. Surprisingly, James's team objected, arguing that the tests could be contaminated or manipulated. "They're stalling," Sarah noted. "Something doesn't add up. If they're so certain you used donor eggs, why resist the very test that would prove their case?" We subpoenaed my complete medical records from the fertility clinic. Dr. Reynolds provided detailed documentation of each IVF cycle, confirming that my eggs had been used in the procedure that resulted in Emma's conception. James's legal team immediately claimed the records had been altered. "We believe Mrs. Harrison colluded with clinic staff to use donor eggs while making Mr. Harrison believe they were using her own," his attorney argued in court. Sarah countered by calling Rebecca as a witness. Though she hadn't directly participated in my treatment, her expert testimony about standard IVF protocols helped establish that the type of deception James alleged would have required multiple staff members to violate medical ethics and potentially commit criminal acts. The scenario Mr. Harrison describes would involve a conspiracy among medical professionals who would be risking their licenses and freedom, Rebecca testified. "It's simply not plausible." While we focused on the fertility angle, Sarah also began building a financial abuse case. James had systematically isolated me financially throughout our marriage, controlling all accounts and assets while limiting my independence. "We need to get you temporary support," Sarah insisted. "You can't continue living under his surveillance without any financial autonomy." The judge granted me a modest temporary maintenance payment and primary physical custody of Emma during the proceedings, though with strict restrictions preventing me from taking her outside a 10-mile radius of the penthouse. James seemed oddly unfazed by this initial custody ruling. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he whispered to me as we left the courtroom. "Once the full medical evidence comes out, she'll be coming home with me permanently." His confidence unsettled me. What did he know that I didn't? As the case progressed, an unexpected issue arose. James began resisting the court's orders to provide his complete medical history. Mr. Harrison's medical records are not relevant to the issue of Mrs. Harrison's alleged reproductive deception, his attorney argued. His medical history is private and protected. Sarah immediately flagged this as suspicious. Why would he fight so hard against disclosing his own medical records in a case centered around fertility issues? There's something there he doesn't want revealed. The judge agreed with Sarah, ordering James to provide his complete medical history, including any fertility testing or treatment he had undergone before or during our marriage. His team immediately filed an appeal, buying time. "We need to find out what he's hiding," Sarah said during a strategy session. "Whatever it is, it might be the key to understanding his obsession with genetic testing and his resistance to the court-ordered paternity test." Despite living in the same penthouse, James and I barely spoke except through lawyers. He arranged his schedule to minimize our interaction, often leaving before I woke up and returning after I'd gone to bed. When he did spend time with Emma, it was always under the watchful eye of the nanny he had hired, a stern woman named Greta who reported every detail back to him. 6 months into the legal battle, we had a temporary breakthrough. The appeals court upheld the original ruling, and James was ordered to submit his medical records within 30 days or face contempt charges. "We've got him cornered," Sarah said triumphantly. "Whatever he's hiding, we'll know soon." But James Harrison hadn't built his fortune by surrendering easily. The night after the ruling, I overheard him on the phone in his study, the door slightly ajar. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying in a low, intense voice. "Find something on Judge Peterson. Everyone has skeletons. Dig deeper." I recorded the conversation on my phone and immediately sent it to Sarah. "He's trying to blackmail the judge," I told her, my voice shaking. "Is there anything he won't do to win?" "This changes everything," Sarah replied. We need to request a new judge and file a complaint. But more importantly, we need to accelerate our own investigation. Whatever is in those medical records has him desperate enough to risk criminal charges. The next day, we began our own deep dive into James Harrison's past, searching for the secret he was willing to destroy us both to protect. With our resources severely limited compared to James's, our investigation had to be strategic. Using my secret savings account, we hired a single investigator, a retired police detective named Frank Diaz, who specialized in financial and medical fraud. "The Harrisons have 3 PIs on you," Frank told me during our first meeting in Sarah's office. "We can't match their surveillance power, but we can be smarter. We need to focus on places they wouldn't expect us to look." Sarah suggested we start with the fertility clinic. If James had any contact with Dr. Reynolds' clinic before you were referred there as a couple, that would be significant. Frank spent 3 days watching the clinic before approaching a janitor who had worked there for over a decade. For a few $100s, the janitor confirmed that James had indeed visited the clinic approximately 1 year before I ever set foot there. "He wasn't with you," Frank reported. "He came alone several times, always after regular hours, and met directly with Dr. Reynolds." The janitor remembered because he drove an expensive car and tipped well. This was our first solid lead. Why would James have visited a fertility specialist before we even started trying to conceive? While Frank continued digging, Sarah pursued another angle. She discovered that a former Harrison estate manager named Walter Green had been abruptly fired 3 years ago with an unusually large severance package that included a strict non-disclosure agreement. "The timing is interesting," Sarah noted. "This was right around when you and James got married." Locating Walter proved challenging. He had moved several times since leaving the Harrisons' employment and seemed intentionally difficult to track. When Frank finally found him living in a small town in Maine, Walter initially refused to speak with us. "I signed an NDA," he said nervously when Frank showed up at his door. "They'll take everything if I talk." "They're trying to take my daughter," I told him over the phone. "Whatever you know might help me keep her." After much persuasion and a legal consultation confirming that NDAs don't cover illegal activities, Walter reluctantly agreed to meet. "James had a serious girlfriend before you," Walter revealed, when we met at a diner halfway between Boston and his home in Maine, Alexandra Whitman. They were together for almost 3 years and were engaged briefly. "What happened?" I asked, never having heard of this woman despite knowing about several of James's other ex-girlfriends. "They were trying to have a baby," Walter explained. "Miss Whitman had multiple miscarriages. Mr. Harrison was obsessed with having an heir. When she couldn't carry to term, he ended the relationship." "Did they seek medical help?" Sarah pressed. Walter nodded. "Extensive testing was done on both of them. I drove Mr. Harrison to several appointments. The last one, I waited in the car, but he came out, different, angry. The next day, he ended things with Miss Whitman and made the entire staff sign new confidentiality agreements specifically about his medical information. Finding Alexandra Whitman took another week. She had moved to California and changed her name after the breakup with James. When Frank finally made contact, she was initially hostile. "I left that part of my life behind for good reason," she said. "Why would I want to dredge it all up again?" "Because another woman is going through what you did," Frank explained, "and a child's future is at stake." Alexandra agreed to a video call with me. She looked nothing like me, blonde and petite, where I was dark-haired and tall, but the haunted look in her eyes when she spoke about James was painfully familiar. "He made me believe I was defective," she said bitterly. 3 years of fertility treatments all focused on my issues, but the last round of testing showed something different. "What did it show?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I never saw the actual results," Alexandra admitted. "James intercepted them, but the doctor slipped and mentioned something about male factor infertility before James cut him off. The next day, James ended our engagement and paid me $2 million to sign an NDA and disappear. Male factor infertility. The pieces were beginning to come together. With this lead, Frank managed to locate the fertility specialist Alexandra had consulted. Dr. Marcus Feinberg had retired to Florida, but agreed to speak with Sarah after she explained the situation. "I can't discuss specific patients due to confidentiality," he hedged during their call. "We understand," Sarah replied. But, hypothetically, if a man had severe male factor infertility that made it virtually impossible for him to father children naturally, would he still be able to produce a biological child through IVF? Hypothetically, it would depend on the specific condition, Dr. Feinberg explained. Some forms of male infertility can be bypassed with procedures like ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where a single sperm is directly injected into an egg. But in cases of azoospermia, where no sperm are present in the ejaculate, the options are more limited. Azoospermia, Sarah repeated, writing down the term. And in that case, the man couldn't father a child even with IVF using his own sperm? Correct. The only options would be donor sperm, adoption, or in rare cases, surgical extraction if sperm are being produced but not making it into the ejaculate. Armed with this information, our next target was finding someone from the fertility clinic where Emma was conceived who might have information about our specific case. Most staff refused to talk, fearing legal repercussions, but Frank identified a nurse named Diane who had left the clinic shortly after our successful IVF cycle. "I remember your case," Diane confirmed when Sarah reached her. "It was unusual." "Unusual how?" Sarah pressed. Diane hesitated. "I shouldn't be discussing this. Patient confidentiality." "Please," I begged. "They're trying to take my daughter by claiming I'm not her biological mother." "You know that's not true." After a long pause, Diane spoke carefully. "There was a special protocol for your cycle. Dr. Reynolds handled everything personally, which wasn't typical. And there was a notation on your file, Harrison Protocol Executive Override." "What did that mean?" "I don't know exactly, but the day of your embryo transfer, I was unexpectedly asked to leave the procedure room. Only Dr. Reynolds and James were present when the embryos were transferred. That never happens. Standard protocol requires at least 2 medical staff. This revelation was disturbing but still didn't provide concrete proof of what had happened. We needed someone with direct knowledge of the Harrison Protocol. Our breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rebecca, scrolling through old employee photos at her hospital, recognized a face. "This woman used to work at your fertility clinic," she told me excitedly. "Maria Lopez. She was the embryologist who would have handled your eggs and embryos. She works in my hospital's lab now." Maria was initially reluctant to meet, but agreed after Rebecca vouched for me. At a coffee shop far from both the Harrison penthouse and her workplace, Maria nervously shared what she knew. "I prepared the embryos for your transfer," she confirmed. 3 good quality blastocysts using your eggs and, well, that's where it gets complicated." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. "The sperm sample wasn't from your husband," Maria said quietly. "At least, not the fresh sample typically used. Dr. Reynolds brought in a specific frozen sperm sample and instructed me to use it instead. The label had a donor number, not your husband's name." "Donor sperm?" I repeated, stunned. But James was obsessed with having his biological child. "That's why I remembered it so clearly," Maria continued. "When I questioned the switch, Dr. Reynolds said it came directly from Mr. Harrison with signed consent forms. She said it was still his genetic material, but from an earlier collection. It seemed strange, but everything was documented, so I proceeded as instructed." "Did you keep records of this?" Sarah asked eagerly. Maria nodded. "Everything is logged in the embryology database. Each sample has a unique identifier. I can't access it anymore, but with a court order, those records would show exactly which donor sample was used. With Maria's testimony, we finally had enough to subpoena the complete embryology records from the clinic. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture far different from what James had presented to the world and to me. "We need to bring this all together before the custody hearing," Sarah said as we prepared our case. "James has been building a narrative that you deceived him about Emma's biological origins. But it appears he's the one who's been lying all along." The final piece came from Dr. Reynolds herself. Faced with a subpoena for the complete embryology records and Maria's testimony, she requested a private meeting with the judge and both legal teams. "I've been Mr. Harrison's physician longer than I've been Mrs. Harrison's," she admitted in the judge's chambers. "He first came to me 3 years before they married, after being diagnosed with azoospermia by another specialist. His condition made it impossible for him to father children naturally. Yet he married Natalie and immediately began trying to conceive," Sarah pointed out. Mr. Harrison was determined to have a biological child, Dr. Reynolds continued uncomfortably. He had me freeze a sperm sample from a donor with similar physical characteristics. His plan was to use this donor sperm without his future wife's knowledge. So, the successful embryo transfer. Sarah began. Used Mrs. Harrison's eggs and the donor sperm Mr. Harrison had selected years earlier, Dr. Reynolds confirmed. He signed all the consent forms and swore to me that Mrs. Harrison was aware and had verbally consented. I now realize that was not the case. With the doctor's testimony and the embryology records, we compiled a sealed file for the judge. The truth was more twisted than I could have imagined. James, not me, had used a donor gamete without consent. Emma was biologically my daughter but not his. The morning of the custody hearing, I sat in the courtroom trembling as the judge reviewed our sealed evidence, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just my future, but Emma's as well. The Suffolk County Family Court was unusually crowded that morning. Word had gotten out that James Harrison, heir to one of Boston's largest real estate fortunes, was embroiled in a scandalous custody battle. Several reporters from local papers lingered in the hallway, hoping for a glimpse of the proceedings. James arrived with his mother Vivian and a team of 3 attorneys, all wearing suits that probably cost more than my monthly living stipend. He didn't look at me as he took his seat at the opposite table, his expression calm and confident. Vivian, however, shot me a venomous glare before arranging her features into a mask of dignified concern. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Patricia Hernandez entered the courtroom. Judge Hernandez was known for her no-nonsense approach and refusal to be intimidated by wealth or status. James had originally tried to have the case assigned to a different judge, one with known connections to Harrison Developments, but his attempt at judge shopping had backfired when his tactics were exposed. "Before we begin," Judge Hernandez stated, "I want to make it clear that I've reviewed all submitted evidence, including the sealed medical records from both parties. This court will focus solely on what serves the best interests of the minor child, Emma Harrison. Celebrity status and financial resources are secondary considerations at best." James's lead attorney, Martin Goodman, began their presentation with practiced precision. "Your Honor, this case hinges on a fundamental deception. Mrs. Harrison deliberately misled my client about the biological origins of their child, depriving him of informed consent in the most intimate decision a couple can make. He displayed a timeline on a large screen, highlighting each fertility treatment and my supposed inconsistent statements about the procedures. The medical evidence will show that Mrs. Harrison could not possibly have conceived a child using her own eggs, given her diagnosed condition of diminished ovarian reserve," Goodman continued. "Yet she presented the child as fully biologically related to both parents, a fiction that only unraveled when Mr. Harrison sought genetic verification." I clenched my fists under the table as Goodman painted me as a calculating manipulator who had orchestrated an elaborate reproductive fraud to secure my position in the Harrison family. "Mr. Harrison loved this child unreservedly," Goodman said, his voice dropping dramatically. "Imagine his devastation upon discovering this betrayal of trust. Despite this, he seeks custody not out of vengeance, but to provide Emma with the stability, resources, and family connections that are her birthright." When James took the stand, he played the role of the wounded husband perfectly. He spoke of our whirlwind romance, his desire for a family, and the crushing disappointment of our fertility struggles. "I supported Natalie through every treatment," he testified, looking appropriately solemn. "We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to conceive. When she finally became pregnant, I was overjoyed. I never questioned that the child was biologically ours, both of ours." "When did you first suspect something was amiss?" Goodman prompted. "As Emma grew, I noticed she had few Harrison family traits," James replied. "Initially, I dismissed these thoughts as paranoid. But when she developed a medical issue requiring detailed family history, I became concerned enough to investigate further. This was a complete fabrication. Emma had never had any medical issues, but James delivered the lie with convincing sincerity." "And what did you discover?" Goodman asked. "The devastating truth that my wife had used donor eggs without my knowledge or consent," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "Emma is not biologically related to Natalie. Your Honor," he continued, looking directly at the judge, "I want to be clear. I love Emma regardless of her biological origins. But Natalie's deception was a fundamental breach of trust that makes co-parenting impossible. As Emma's only biological parent, I believe she should be in my primary custody. When Sarah began her cross-examination, her approach was methodical. Mr. Harrison, you've testified at length about Mrs. Harrison's alleged deception regarding donor eggs, she began. Let's talk about your own medical history. You visited Dr. Reynolds's fertility clinic approximately 1 year before you even met my client, correct? James shifted uncomfortably. I don't recall the exact timing. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 42, visitor logs from Boston Fertility Partners showing Mr. Harrison had 6 appointments with Dr. Reynolds between May and August 2017, more than a year before he met Mrs. Harrison. The judge examined the records as James's attorney objected. My client's prior medical consultations are irrelevant to the issue at hand. On the contrary, Sarah countered, they are directly relevant to establishing the timeline of reproductive decisions and disclosures. Mr. Harrison has put biological parentage at the center of this case. Judge Hernandez overruled the objection, and Sarah continued. Mr. Harrison, prior to meeting my client, you were diagnosed with a condition called azoospermia, were you not? James's face flushed. I declined to answer on the grounds of medical privacy. Your Honor, the court has already ordered full medical disclosure from both parties, Sarah reminded the judge. Mr. Harrison cannot selectively invoke medical privacy after making my client's fertility the centerpiece of his case. The witness will answer the question, Judge Hernandez directed. After a tense silence, James admitted, I was diagnosed with a form of male infertility, yes. Not just a form of male infertility, Sarah pressed. Specifically azoospermia, a condition that makes it impossible for you to father children naturally or even through standard IVF. Isn't that correct? The diagnosis was preliminary, James hedged. Further testing showed. Mr. Harrison, Sarah interrupted, did you disclose this diagnosis to Natalie before your marriage or at any point during your fertility treatments? I didn't think it was relevant, he replied stiffly. We were focused on her issues. Sarah spent the next 30 minutes methodically dismantling James's narrative, establishing that he had deliberately concealed his own infertility while blaming me for our conception difficulties. When Vivian took the stand, she emphasized the importance of Harrison biological connections, unwittingly strengthening our case. The Harrison family has maintained its bloodline for 7 generations, she testified proudly. Our family trust and inheritance are structured around biological succession. James understood his responsibility to continue this legacy. And if James couldn't produce a biological heir? Sarah asked. That was never a consideration, Vivian replied dismissively. Harrison men have always been virile. Mrs. Harrison, Sarah continued, were you aware of your son's azoospermia diagnosis? Vivian's confident facade cracked slightly. I was not privy to James's private medical information. Yet you were involved in discussions about the family's biological legacy and heir requirements? Of course, I am the matriarch of the Harrison family. So you placed immense pressure on your son to produce a biological child, knowing or perhaps not knowing that he was physically incapable of doing so? Vivian's nostrils flared. I object to your characterization. That's not for you to decide, Mrs. Harrison, Judge Hernandez interjected. Please answer the question. Before Vivian could respond, Sarah presented the sealed medical envelope that had been prepared with all the evidence we had gathered. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 86, the complete embryology records from Boston Fertility Partners regarding the IVF cycle that resulted in Emma Harrison's conception. The judge opened the sealed envelope and began reviewing its contents. I watched as her expression shifted from professional neutrality to visible shock. Counsel, approach the bench, she ordered. The attorneys from both sides gathered before the judge for a heated discussion that lasted several minutes. James's face drained of color as Goodman returned to their table and whispered urgently to him. Vivian looked on with growing alarm. This court will take a 30-minute recess, Judge Hernandez announced. When we resume, I expect Mr. Harrison's team to be prepared to address the contents of Exhibit 86 fully and honestly. As the judge left the courtroom, chaos erupted at James's table. He and his attorneys huddled in intense discussion, occasionally casting glances in my direction. What happens now? I whispered to Sarah as we retreated to a private conference room. Now we watch their world implode, she replied with grim satisfaction. The embryology records prove conclusively that James arranged for donor sperm to be used without your knowledge. Emma is biologically yours, but not his, the exact opposite of what he's been claiming. Will the judge make this public? That depends on how James responds. He has two options: withdraw his claims and negotiate a reasonable settlement, or continue fighting and have everything exposed in open court. Given his obsession with the Harrison reputation, my guess is he'll opt for damage control. When court resumed 30 minutes later, the tension was palpable. James looked defeated, slumped in his chair with Vivian whispering furiously beside him. Judge Hernandez addressed the courtroom with steely resolve. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds several disturbing elements in this case that must be addressed before proceeding. She turned to James. Mr. Harrison, the embryology records clearly document that you personally arranged for donor sperm to be used in the successful IVF procedure without Mrs. Harrison's knowledge or consent. You signed all relevant forms and explicitly instructed Dr. Reynolds not to inform your wife of this substitution. Do you wish to revise your previous testimony? The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to James. After a long moment, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I was trying to protect my family legacy, he said, not meeting anyone's gaze. The trust requires biological heirs. I couldn't admit my condition. So you deceived your wife, allowed her to believe her fertility issues were the sole problem, subjected her to years of invasive treatments, and then attempted to gain custody of her biological child by falsely accusing her of the very deception you had committed? The judge summarized, her disgust evident. It wasn't like that, James protested weakly. I loved Emma. I just wanted. Mr. Harrison, Judge Hernandez interrupted, this court is not concerned with your rationalizations. The evidence shows a pattern of deception, manipulation, and psychological abuse directed at your wife, culminating in a fraudulent legal action designed to separate a mother from her biological child. She turned to address the entire courtroom. In light of these revelations, I am issuing an immediate temporary order granting Mrs. Harrison's sole legal and physical custody of Emma Harrison pending final divorce proceedings. Mr. Harrison will have supervised visitation only, should Mrs. Harrison agree to it. Vivian let out an audible gasp and clutched her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. Additionally, the judge continued, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to reproductive fraud, perjury, and witness intimidation. Mr. Harrison's attorneys may also face ethics investigations for their role in presenting demonstrably false claims to this court. As the judge's words sank in, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. After months of fear and uncertainty, the truth had finally emerged. Emma would remain with me where she belonged. The judge had one final statement. The court will also consider additional sanctions for Mr. Hanats. Harrison's attempt to use his financial resources to manipulate these proceedings, including his documented efforts to pressure court officials and witnesses. This behavior reflects a profound disrespect for the legal system and will not be tolerated, regardless of the wealth or status of the individual involved. As we left the courtroom, James attempted to approach me. Natalie, we need to talk, he began, his voice low and urgent. This doesn't have to become public. We can reach an agreement. Stay away from my client, Sarah warned, stepping between us. Any communication needs to go through proper legal channels. Looking over Sarah's shoulder at the man I had once loved, I felt nothing but a mixture of pity and disgust. You never loved Emma for herself, I said quietly. She was just a means to secure your inheritance. That's the real tragedy here. As we walked away, I heard Vivian's shrill voice berating James in the hallway. The Harrison empire was beginning to crumble from within, but my focus was already elsewhere. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The aftermath of the custody hearing was immediate and far-reaching. Judge Hernandez ordered the courtroom sealed for the presentation of the complete medical evidence, but enough details emerged through legal filings to spark intense speculation in Boston's social circles. When court reconvened the following week, Dr. Reynolds was called to testify under oath about the full sequence of events surrounding Emma's conception. The fertility specialist appeared nervous, her usual confidence replaced by the demeanor of someone caught in a situation spinning rapidly out of control. "Dr. Reynolds," Sarah began, "please explain to the court exactly when you first began treating James Harrison and for what condition." "I first saw Mr. Harrison in May 2017, approximately 14 months before he brought Mrs. Harrison in as a patient," she replied. "He came to me after receiving a diagnosis of non-obstructive azoospermia from another specialist." "And what exactly is that condition?" Sarah asked, though we had covered this ground extensively in preparation. Non-obstructive azoospermia means there are no sperm present in the ejaculate due to a production problem rather than a blockage. In Mr. Harrison's case, genetic testing confirmed a Y chromosome microdeletion that made natural conception impossible. Was this condition treatable? Dr. Reynolds shook her head. No. In cases like Mr. Harrison's, the only options for having children are donor sperm, adoption, or in some rare instances, experimental surgical procedures with very low success rates. And did you explain this to Mr. Harrison? Yes, he was displeased with the diagnosis, she said carefully. He explained that his family had strict requirements regarding biological heirs and inheritance. He asked about options that would allow him to have a child that would appear to be biologically his. What solution did he ultimately choose? Mr. Harrison selected a sperm donor who matched his physical characteristics: tall, blue eyes, similar facial features. He had me freeze samples from this donor for future use. He explained that he would find a suitable wife and have me treat the couple for infertility, regardless of whether his future wife actually had fertility issues. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Even knowing what was coming, hearing the calculated nature of James's deception was shocking. "Are you saying," Sarah clarified, "that James Harrison planned to deceive his future wife about his infertility and the biological parentage of their children before he even met Mrs. Harrison?" "Yes," Dr. Reynolds admitted, looking uncomfortable. "He made me sign an extraordinary confidentiality agreement beyond the usual doctor-patient relationship. In retrospect, I should have refused to participate, but the Harrison family has considerable influence in Boston medical circles. And when James brought Natalie to your clinic, what happened?" "I conducted the standard fertility workup on both of them. Mrs. Harrison did have mild diminished ovarian reserve, but it was treatable. In a typical case, I would have expected success with standard IVF." "Did you inform Mrs. Harrison about her husband's condition?" "No," Dr. Reynolds admitted, her voice barely audible. "Mr. Harrison insisted that all focus be placed on Mrs. Harrison's fertility issues. He threatened to ruin my practice if I revealed his condition." "So, you allowed Mrs. Harrison to believe she was the primary cause of their conception difficulties?" "Yes," she replied, looking directly at me for the first time. "I deeply regret my role in this deception." "And the successful IVF cycle that resulted in Emma's conception, please describe exactly what happened." Dr. Reynolds detailed how James had arranged everything so that on the day of our embryo transfer, he was present in the procedure room while the usual nurses were sent away. He personally ensured that the donor sperm he had selected years earlier was used to fertilize my eggs, creating embryos that were biologically mine but not his. "Did Mrs. Harrison consent to the use of donor sperm?" "No," Dr. Reynolds stated firmly. "Mr. Harrison presented signed consent forms, but I now believe Mrs. Harrison's signature was forged. She was explicitly told we were using her eggs and her husband's sperm." The nurse who had assisted with our IVF cycle, Diana Martinez, testified next, confirming that James had arranged for her to be called away just before the critical moment of the procedure. "When I returned, the embryo transfer was complete," she explained. "The lab records showed a note about executive protocol override, which is not standard terminology in our clinic. The most damning testimony came from Maria Lopez, the embryologist who had handled our case. The sperm sample used was labeled with a donor number, not Mr. Harrison's name," she stated. When I questioned this, Dr. Reynolds assured me that both patients had consented to donor material. The resulting embryos were created using Mrs. Harrison's eggs and the donor sperm. As Maria testified, I watched James's face. He sat stonily, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, but the confident demeanor he had maintained throughout the proceedings had vanished. Beside him, Vivian looked physically ill, her face ashen as the full extent of her son's deception became clear. The final piece of evidence was the genetic testing that Judge Hernandez had ordered at the beginning of the custody dispute. The results were conclusive. I was Emma's biological mother, while James had no biological relationship to her whatsoever. Your Honor, Sarah summarized, the evidence clearly demonstrates that James Harrison, not Natalie, perpetrated reproductive fraud. He deliberately concealed his infertility, subjected his wife to unnecessary medical procedures, used donor sperm without her knowledge or consent, and then attempted to gain custody of her biological child through false accusations and character assassination. When James's attorney attempted to mount a defense, it was half-hearted at best. Mr. Harrison acknowledges certain omissions regarding his medical history, Goodman conceded. However, his actions were motivated by complex family pressures and his genuine desire to have a child. Mr. Goodman, Judge Hernandez interrupted, let me be perfectly clear. Your client didn't merely omit information. He orchestrated an elaborate deception spanning years, involving medical professionals, falsified consent forms, and ultimately a fraudulent legal action designed to separate a mother from her child. This court finds such behavior reprehensible. She turned to address James directly. Mr. Harrison, your testimony that Mrs. Harrison is sterile and used donor eggs without your knowledge was a complete fabrication. You knew it was false when you made these allegations under oath, which constitutes perjury. Furthermore, you attempted to use your financial resources to manipulate these proceedings through intimidation of witnesses and court personnel. James finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Your Honor, the Harrison family has certain requirements regarding succession and inheritance. I was trying to fulfill my obligations while deceiving your wife in the court. Judge Hernandez finished for him. Mr. Harrison, this court is not concerned with your family's succession plans. The law is concerned with truth, consent, and the best interests of the child. On all counts, your actions have demonstrated a profound disregard for these principles. Vivian stood abruptly. This is outrageous, she exclaimed. The Harrison name has been respected in Boston for generations. We will not tolerate this public humiliation. Mrs. Harrison, sit down or I will have you removed, the judge warned. Your family name affords you no special privileges in this courtroom. Vivian gathered her belongings and stormed out, the heavy courtroom door slamming behind her. James watched her go with an expression of dawning realization his mother's support was conditional on maintaining the Harrison facade of perfection. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and immediate. I was granted full legal and physical custody of Emma. James would have no visitation rights unless and until he completed psychological evaluation and treatment for what the judge termed pathological deception and control issues. Additionally, the court ordered a complete financial audit to ensure that Harrison assets that should rightfully be part of our divorce settlement weren't being hidden or transferred. Finally, Judge Hernandez concluded, this court finds that Mr. Harrison's actions constitute reproductive fraud, a particularly egregious form of domestic abuse. Mrs. Harrison is entitled to significant compensation for the physical, emotional, and psychological harm inflicted upon her. As the implications of the ruling sank in, I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, vindication, relief, anger, and most of all, bone-deep exhaustion. The battle had been won, but the war had taken its toll. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for statements. Sarah fielded most questions with practiced skill, emphasizing that the case represented a new frontier in family law regarding reproductive deception. One persistent reporter caught up with us at the parking garage. Mrs. Harrison, how does it feel to learn the truth about your daughter's biological origins? I paused, considering the question carefully. Emma is my daughter in every way that matters, I replied finally. The true deception wasn't about biology, it was about trust and consent. No one has the right to make reproductive decisions for someone else without their knowledge. As we drove away from the courthouse, I called my sister Melissa. It's over, I told her, my voice breaking. We won. Emma stays with me. I never doubted it, she replied, her voice warm with relief. When are you coming home? Home. The word resonated in a way it hadn't for years. Not the cold, monitored penthouse where I'd been living under James's surveillance, but a real home where Emma and I could finally begin to heal. "Tomorrow," I said, making the decision in that moment. "We're coming home tomorrow." The Harrison empire began to crumble within days of the court's ruling. The Boston Globe ran a front-page exposé on the case, focusing on the reproductive fraud angle that had rarely been litigated in Massachusetts courts. While they maintained some discretion regarding Emma, the details of James's deception and attempts to manipulate the legal system were laid bare for public consumption. Vivian Harrison retreated to the family's estate in the Berkshires, refusing all contact with the press. The Harrison Real Estate Group's stock dropped 15% as investors questioned the stability of the company's leadership. Several development projects were put on hold as partners distanced themselves from the scandal. James made one last desperate attempt at reconciliation, arriving at Melissa's house unannounced 2 weeks after the ruling. I was in the backyard watching Emma play when he appeared at the gate. "Natalie, please," he said, his designer suit incongruous in my sister's middle-class neighborhood. "We can still fix this. For Emma's sake." I regarded him calmly, surprised to find that his presence no longer intimidated me. "There's nothing to fix, James. The court has ruled. Emma stays with me." "I've lost everything," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Mother has basically disowned me. The board is forcing me to step down. The family trust is being restructured to exclude me. I never meant for things to go this far." "You meant to take my daughter from me," I reminded him. "You spent years planning an elaborate deception and then tried to use it against me in court. What did you think would happen?" "I loved Emma," he insisted. "I still do." "You loved what she represented," I corrected. "A continuation of the Harrison legacy. If you'd truly loved her for herself, none of this would have happened." He stood silently for a moment, watching Emma climbing on the play structure Melissa's husband had built. "She has my eyes," he said softly. "No," I replied. "She has the donor's eyes. The donor you selected because he looked like you. Emma has never had anything of yours, James, because you never gave her anything real." After he left, I sat on the porch swing trying to process my feelings. Despite everything he'd done, I felt a strange pity for James. He had been so consumed by the Harrison legacy that he'd sacrificed any chance at genuine connection or happiness. The divorce settlement, when it finally came, was generous by any standard. James's attempts to portray me as a gold digger had backfired spectacularly, and his legal team advised him to settle quickly before additional damages were awarded. I received the penthouse, which I immediately sold, a substantial cash settlement, and ongoing support for Emma that would ensure her financial security regardless of her relationship with the Harrison family. Most importantly, I maintained full custody with James, granted only limited supervised visitation after completing extensive therapy. Whether he would ever follow through remained to be seen. With the settlement money, I purchased a comfortable but modest home in a quiet suburb outside Boston, close enough to Melissa but far from the Harrison sphere of influence. The house had a fenced yard where Emma could play, a modern kitchen where I rediscovered my love of cooking, and enough distance from the past 2 years to begin healing. I also reopened the event planning business I had dreamed of before marriage, specializing in nonprofit fundraisers and community events, rather than the elite galas that had once been my focus. The work was fulfilling in a way that my role as Mrs. Harrison never had been. Rebecca, the fertility nurse who had been my lifeline throughout the ordeal, became Emma's godmother. Her expertise and friendship had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, and our bond had grown stronger through the shared experience. "Have you thought about what you'll tell Emma when she's older?" Rebecca asked one evening as we watched my daughter, now 3, playing with her toys. "I've thought about it constantly," I admitted. "Dr. Chen, the child psychologist I've been consulting, says honesty is important, but it needs to be age-appropriate. For now, Emma knows that Mommy and Daddy don't live together anymore because they couldn't get along. As she gets older, I'll explain more." "And about her biological origins?" "She'll always know she's mine," I said firmly. "When she's old enough to understand, I'll explain about the donor. She has a right to know her genetic heritage, especially for medical reasons. But I won't poison her against James. Whatever his flaws, his relationship with Emma is for them to determine as she grows up." The truth was, James had attended only 3 supervised visits in the 6 months since the divorce was finalized. Each time, he seemed uncomfortable and out of place, bringing expensive gifts but struggling to connect with a toddler who barely remembered him. After the 3rd visit, he had called to say he was relocating to the London office indefinitely. "I think it's better this way," he had said. "She deserves a clean start." Part of me was relieved, while another part mourned the father Emma would never truly know, but I had learned that family was defined by love and commitment, not by genetic connections or legal documents. The most unexpected outcome of the whole ordeal was my own transformation. The woman who had once been so desperate for James Harrison's approval that she'd abandoned her career and identity was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and fiercely protective of the life she was rebuilding. Vivian Harrison made one final attempt to insert herself into our lives, arriving unannounced at our new home shortly after Emma's 3rd birthday. "I have a right to know my granddaughter," she declared, standing on my front porch with a gift-wrapped package, regardless of the circumstances. I regarded her thoughtfully before responding. "Emma isn't your granddaughter, Vivian. You made that abundantly clear in court when you emphasized the importance of Harrison blood. By your own definition, she has no connection to your family." "That's not fair," she protested. "I've had time to reconsider my position." "So have I replied calmly. "Emma deserves to be loved for herself, not as a means to continue a family legacy or salvage a reputation. When she's older, she can decide if she wants a relationship with you. Until then, I'll protect her from the toxic environment that prioritizes status over truth." As Vivian drove away, I felt the last threads connecting me to the Harrison family finally break. The future stretched before us, undefined but full of possibility. That evening, as I tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at me with those startlingly blue eyes that had once seemed to connect her to James. "Mommy, are we happy?" she asked with the direct simplicity only a child can manage. "Yes, sweetheart," I answered, smoothing her hair. "We're very happy." "Because it's just us?" I considered her question carefully. "No, not because it's just us. We're happy because we have each other, and because we have people who love us for exactly who we are. That's what makes a real family." As she drifted off to sleep, I reflected on the irony that James's obsession with creating a biological legacy had cost him the family he so desperately wanted. Meanwhile, I had gained something far more precious than the Harrison name or fortune: the freedom to build a life based on truth rather than deception, and the wisdom to recognize that real family connections transcend biology. The journey had been painful, but sitting there in the soft glow of Emma's nightlight, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had survived the storm and emerged stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, mother and daughter, bound by love and the truth that had set us free. If my story has resonated with you in any way, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of overcoming impossible odds. Have you ever discovered a truth that completely changed your perspective on a relationship? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Your support means everything as Emma and I continue building our new life together. Thank you for being part of our journey. And remember, the most important family legacy isn't about money or status, it's about love, truth, and the courage to stand up for yourself even when it seems the whole world is against you.